The laughter at Dan and Michelle's backyard barbecue faltered as Jake Wilson raised his beer bottle in an exaggerated toast. His eyes locked not on his wife beside him, but on Sarah, standing uncomfortably near Nolan across the patio. "To new life," Jake announced, his smile too wide, his voice carrying deliberately across the gathering. "And to finally telling the truth about who's really going to be a father soon." A confused silence fell over the party. Nolan Parker stood perfectly still, his expression unreadable as he observed Jake's swagger. The plastic cup in Nolan's hand remained steady, while his wife's eyes darted nervously between the two men. Something in Nolan's calm seemed to unsettle Jake, whose confident smirk flickered just slightly when Nolan reached into his pocket. "You know what, Jake?" Nolan said quietly. "I think that's an excellent idea." Nolan Parker folded the newspaper precisely along its original creases before placing it on the breakfast table, a small ritual that brought order to his mornings. The kitchen was filled with amber sunlight that caught the steam rising from his coffee mug, creating ephemeral patterns that disappeared as quickly as they formed. "Is there anything special you need from the store today?" he asked, watching as Sarah moved around the kitchen with practiced efficiency. Something about her movements seemed different lately, more deliberate, as though she were performing rather than simply existing in their shared space. "No, nothing special," Sarah replied, her back to him as she rinsed her coffee cup. "I might be home late tonight, though. Monthly planning meeting." Nolan nodded, though she couldn't see him. "That's the third late meeting this month, isn't it?" She turned, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "The Wilson account is demanding a lot of attention." "Jake Wilson's account?" Nolan asked, the name of their neighbor landing with unexpected weight. "His company's," Sarah corrected quickly. "You know he's just the sales rep." Nolan studied the slight color that had risen to her cheeks. After 15 years of marriage, he'd learned to read the subtle shifts in her expressions, the microscopic tells that signaled something beneath the surface. "Of course," he said, choosing his words carefully. "Give him my regards." She nodded too quickly and busied herself wiping an already clean counter. The community picnic table at Oak Ridge Park sat at the nexus of 4 adjoining backyards, a shared space where property lines blurred into neighborly communion. Nolan set down a platter of grilled vegetables as Dan and Michelle Gibson arrived with homemade potato salad. The evening air carried the pleasant smell of charcoal and freshly cut grass. "Look who finally escaped the office," Jake Wilson called out, raising his beer in Sarah's direction as she emerged from their back gate. His wife, Elaine, glanced up briefly from arranging plates before returning to her task. "Barely," Sarah laughed, the sound slightly higher than her natural register. "Those quarterly reports won't file themselves." Jake moved immediately to help Sarah with the cooler she carried, his hand lingering on hers a moment longer than necessary. "Let me get that for you. Wouldn't want to strain anything important." "I think she can manage a cooler, Jake," Nolan observed mildly, passing plates around the table. "Just being neighborly," Jake replied, with an easy grin that didn't quite match the challenging look in his eyes. "That's what we do around here, right? Help each other out?" Dan cleared his throat, clearly sensing the undercurrent. "Michelle was just telling me about that new community garden proposal. What do you think, Nolan? Worth the HOA fee increase?" As conversation shifted to safer territory, Nolan noticed how Jake positioned himself beside Sarah at the table, leaning toward her when he spoke, creating a bubble that seemed designed to exclude others. More concerning was how naturally Sarah seemed to accommodate this proximity, angling herself toward Jake in subtle mirroring. Across the table, Elaine's tight smile and deliberate focus on cutting her food into perfectly even pieces spoke volumes. "Everything all right with you and Jake?" Nolan asked Michelle quietly as they collected empty plates later. Elaine seems tense. Michelle's momentary hesitation told him everything. You know how it is. Marriages have their seasons. The house was quiet at 11:47 p.m. when Nolan closed his laptop. Sarah had texted that the client dinner was running late, and he shouldn't wait up. He moved through their darkened home with the careful steps of someone respecting another's sleep, though no one else was there. Passing the nursery, set up months ago in hopeful anticipation, now gathering dust, Nolan noticed the baby monitor light blinking. He'd been testing different models, preparing for the family they'd been trying to start. This one had been left on, its receiver downstairs. He picked it up, intending to switch it off, when voices emerged from the static, Sarah's voice, coming through unexpectedly. The monitor had somehow connected to her phone in her car, her Bluetooth carrying the conversation through the device meant to protect their future child. "I can't keep doing this, Jake." Sarah's voice sounded tired, vulnerable. "Nolan deserves better. Do you love him?" Jake's voice was closer to the phone, intimate. A pause stretched across the static. "That's not the point." "It's exactly the point," Jake insisted. "And what about the baby? We need to tell him." "There's time to figure that out," Sarah replied, her voice small. "It's still early. I want everyone to know it's mine," Jake said with possessive certainty. "I'm tired of pretending." The monitor went silent as the connection dropped. Nolan stood motionless in the dark nursery, the plastic device clutched in his hand, the future it represented crumbling around him. His mind, always methodical, always measured, began calculating with cold precision even as his chest constricted with pain. Not if, but how. Not whether to confront the betrayal, but how to bring the truth into the light with dignity intact. Nolan placed the baby monitor on his desk with the deliberate care of someone handling evidence. The house's empty silence seemed to mock the fullness of his thoughts. He sank into his chair, the weight of what he'd heard pressing him downward like a physical force. "It's mine." Jake's words echoed in his mind. Not a possibility, not a suspicion, but a declaration of possession of Sarah. Of the child they had been trying to conceive together for 2 years. Nolan's hand moved unconsciously to the framed wedding photo on his desk, 15 years captured in silver. He turned it face down with a soft click against the wood. Breathe, analyze, respond. The methodical approach that had served him through every professional crisis now felt insufficient against this intimate betrayal. His mind raced between memories, reassessing every late meeting, every neighborhood gathering, every casual mention of Jake's name that he'd dismissed as innocent. The truth had been there all along, hidden beneath the surface of their lives, like rot beneath fresh paint. Part of him wanted to call Sarah immediately, to demand explanations, to let rage erupt through his careful composure. Another part, quieter but more insistent, urged caution. Confrontation without preparation would only give them the opportunity to construct more elaborate lies. The strategist in him, the part that had built his career on careful planning, began to assert itself through the emotional storm. If truth was to be served, it needed to be irrefutable, displayed in a way that left no room for denial. Nolan opened his laptop with renewed purpose. Truth, not vengeance. Evidence, not accusations. The home security system had been Sarah's idea, ironically enough. Nolan accessed its history with the administrator password, scanning through footage of their driveway. The timestamps aligned with Sarah's late meetings, her car departing, then returning hours later than her text messages had indicated. "Working on that quarterly report," he murmured, watching as her car pulled in at 11:52 p.m. last Thursday, Jake's distinctive SUV visible 2 blocks down, headlights extinguished. Nolan moved methodically through digital records, cell phone location data shared through their family plan, credit card statements showing restaurant charges in places Sarah had never mentioned, text message logs revealing patterns of communication that spiked during supposed work hours. He arranged the evidence chronologically in encrypted files, each piece building upon the last to form an undeniable narrative. The clinical precision of his documentation stood in stark contrast to the simmering pain beneath his concentrated expression. "Everything all right, honey?" Sarah asked, appearing in the doorway of his home office. "You've been in here for hours." Nolan smiled with practiced ease, minimizing the window on his screen. "Just catching up on some contract reviews. The Morrison project is getting complicated." "Don't work too hard," she said, her casual tone betrayed by the way her eyes flicked toward his computer screen. "I made that pasta you like for dinner. I'll be right there," he assured her. After she left, Nolan connected another device to his computer, a small recorder that would sync with the baby monitor's receiver. He tested the connection, ensuring it would capture clearly. It felt both wrong and necessary, this invasion of privacy, this gathering of truth. But as Nolan secured the evidence in an encrypted cloud folder, he knew that facing reality, however painful, was the only path forward that preserved his dignity. The neighborhood email thread buzzed with typical suburban enthusiasm. "Annual Memorial Day BBQ at the Gibsons. BYOB and a side to share." Nolan's phone chimed with the notification just as Michelle Gibson appeared at his fence, garden shears in hand. "Did you get the email?" she called, waving toward his phone. "Dan's determined to outdo last year's party. He's been marinating ribs since yesterday." "Just saw it," Nolan replied, moving to the fence with a neighborly smile that felt foreign on his face. "Count us in. Sarah makes a mean potato salad." Michelle nodded, hesitating before adding, "Jake and Elaine are coming too. I wasn't sure if—" She trailed off, discomfort evident in her expression. "If there would be tension?" Nolan finished for her. "Why would there be?" Michelle's eyes widened slightly at his direct question. "Oh, there seemed to be some awkwardness at the park get-together." She busied herself with trimming an already neat hedge. "Ancient history," Nolan assured her with a wave of his hand. "Actually, I'm looking forward to seeing everyone together. It's been too long since we've all had a chance to really talk." Something in his tone made Michelle look up, studying him with newfound curiosity. "Well, that's good to hear. 3 o'clock on Monday, then." "We wouldn't miss it," Nolan confirmed. "Oh, and Michelle? Will there be plenty of other people there, too? Neighbors from the next street over, perhaps?" "Half the neighborhood, probably." She laughed, visibly relieved by his enthusiasm. Dan can't resist playing host to a crowd. "Perfect," Nolan said, his smile never reaching his eyes. "The more witnesses, the better." "Witnesses?" Michelle asked, brow furrowing. "To Dan's grilling skills," Nolan clarified smoothly. "Last year's ribs deserve a proper audience." As Michelle returned to her gardening, Nolan walked back toward his house, plans crystallizing in his mind. A public gathering, multiple witnesses, the perfect setting for truth to emerge, not through accusation, but through incontrovertible evidence. He checked his watch, calculating the days until Memorial Day. Just enough time to make final preparations, to ensure that when the moment came, there would be no escape into further deception. For the first time since hearing Jake's voice on the monitor, Nolan felt something like certainty. Not happiness, not peace, but the solid ground of purpose beneath his feet. The Gibson backyard hummed with Memorial Day festivities. Red and blue paper plates dotted picnic tables, while the scent of charcoal and grilling meat saturated the air. Nolan guided Sarah through the side gate, potato salad bowl in his hands, recorder securely in his pocket. Fashionably late, Dan called from his post at the grill, spatula raised in greeting. Just in time, burgers are hitting their prime. Nolan scanned the crowd. At least 20 neighbors milled about the yard, exactly the audience he had hoped for. He spotted Elaine Wilson sitting alone at the far table, her posture rigid, drink untouched. "Sarah! Nolan!" Michelle hurried over, taking the potato salad. Perfect timing. Jake just arrived, too. He's getting drinks by the cooler. "Wonderful," Nolan said, his smile measured. "It's good to see everyone together." Sarah's fingers tightened around his arm. "I should help Michelle with the food." "Of course," Nolan replied, releasing her as Jake approached, 2 beers in hand. "Parker, man of the hour," Jake called too loudly. He extended a beer toward Nolan. "Thought you might need refreshment after the long journey across the fence line." "Thanks," Nolan accepted the bottle, noting how Jake's eyes followed Sarah as she moved toward the food table. "Quite a turnout today." "Nothing brings the neighborhood together like Dan's overcooked burgers," Jake laughed, clapping Nolan's shoulder with excessive familiarity. "And good company," Nolan added, maintaining eye contact until Jake looked away first. From across the yard, Nolan caught Michelle watching them, her expression concerned. She wasn't the only one. Several neighbors had noticed the strained interaction, conversations momentarily suspended before resuming with deliberate casualness. "Should be an interesting afternoon," Nolan murmured, taking a deliberate sip of his beer as Jake drifted toward Sarah at the food table, leaving an invisible thread of tension stretching across the yard. An hour into the barbecue, the initial social formalities had given way to the relaxed rhythm of suburban celebration. Lawn chairs formed conversational clusters across the Gibsons' backyard, voices rising and falling with laughter and debate. Nolan maintained his position near the grill, engaged in conversation with Dan and 2 neighbors from the next street over, while keeping Jake and Sarah in his peripheral vision. Each time he looked their way, they were closer, Jake perpetually finding reasons to stand near her, to touch her elbow when making a point, to lean in when she spoke. "So I told the contractor, that's not code, that's a catastrophe waiting to happen," Dan was saying when Jake's voice cut across the yard. "Sarah, tell them about the baby," Jake called out, silencing several nearby conversations. "Everyone's dying to hear the good news." Sarah froze, plastic fork suspended over her plate. "Jake, I don't think—" "Don't be modest," Jake insisted, moving to stand beside her, one hand settling possessively at the small of her back. "Best news we've had around here in ages." Elaine set down her untouched plate and walked inside the house without a word. "Congratulations are in order, I guess," offered a neighbor uncertainly, glancing between Sarah and Nolan. "Thank you," Nolan replied evenly, moving toward his wife. "Though we were hoping to wait a bit longer before making announcements." Jake's smile turned predatory. "Sometimes plans change, don't they, Sarah?" The discomfort among the guests was palpable now. Michelle appeared at Sarah's side, attempting damage control. "Who needs dessert?" "I've got 3 different pies inside." "Actually," Jake said, raising his voice again as he grabbed another beer, "I think we should toast to new beginnings, to Sarah and the baby." His emphasis hung in the air like a challenge. Nolan met his gaze steadily across the yard. "To new beginnings," he echoed, his calm voice carrying an undercurrent that made several guests shift uncomfortably. Jake's eyes narrowed, clearly unsatisfied with Nolan's composure. He moved toward the center of the gathering, commanding attention in the way of someone about to make a speech. "While we're all together," Jake announced, positioning himself at the center of the patio where everyone could see him, "I think there's something that needs to be cleared up." He took a long pull from his beer, eyes moving from Sarah's pale face to Nolan's composed expression. The assembled neighbors fell silent, paper plates and plastic forks suspended in collective discomfort. Dan shot a questioning look at Michelle, who shook her head slightly, equally confused. "Jake," Sarah said quietly, "this isn't the place." "I disagree," Jake replied, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent yard. "I think our friends deserve to know the truth, don't you?" Nolan stood perfectly still, watching as Jake performed for his audience, building toward the moment that would shatter the careful facades they'd all maintained. "The truth about what, Jake?" Dan asked, attempting to diffuse the situation. Jake smiled, a flash of teeth with no warmth behind it. "About fatherhood, about honesty, about who's really going to be a dad." Sarah took a step toward him. "Please don't do this." "I'm tired of pretending," Jake continued, ignoring her plea. He raised his beer bottle in an exaggerated toast. "To new life, and to finally telling the truth about who's really going to be a father soon." A confused silence fell over the party as the implication of his words sank in. Eyes darted between Nolan, Sarah, and Jake, understanding dawning in uncomfortable waves. "What exactly are you saying, Jake?" Michelle asked, though her expression showed she already knew. Jake's smile widened as he locked eyes with Nolan across the gathering. "I'm saying that Sarah's pregnant, and I'm the father, not Nolan." He enunciated each word with deliberate clarity. "And it's time everyone knew it." The collective intake of breath from the assembled neighbors seemed to pull all oxygen from the yard. Sarah's face crumpled as she stared at the ground, unable to meet anyone's eyes. Jake stood triumphant, clearly savoring the moment of shocked silence that followed his announcement. Every head turned toward Nolan, waiting for his reaction to this public humiliation. The tension stretched like a wire pulled to breaking point as he reached calmly into his pocket. "You know what, Jake?" Nolan said quietly, his voice somehow carrying across the silent yard. "I think that's an excellent idea." The suspended silence seemed to stretch into infinity as Nolan stood at the center of everyone's attention. Jake's triumphant smile remained fixed, though a flicker of uncertainty crossed his eyes when Nolan reached into his pocket without anger or protest. Nolan withdrew a small black recording device, holding it up where everyone could see it. His movements were deliberate, almost ceremonial, as he pressed the play button and placed it on the nearby patio table. "Since we're clearing the air," Nolan said quietly, his voice carrying in the silence, "I think everyone should hear the whole truth." The device crackled to life, and Sarah's voice emerged with crystal clarity. "I can't keep doing this, Jake. Nolan deserves better." Jake's voice followed. "Do you love him?" A pause. "That's not the point." "It's exactly the point," Jake's recorded voice insisted. "And what about the baby? We need to tell him. There's time to figure that out." "It's still early. I want everyone to know it's mine. I'm tired of pretending." The recording ended, leaving behind a silence more profound than before. Jake's face had drained of color, his earlier bravado evaporating. Sarah stood frozen, tears streaming silently down her face. No one moved. No one spoke. The collective judgment of 24 neighbors hung in the air like an invisible verdict. Nolan picked up the device, slipping it back into his pocket with the same calm precision with which he'd produced it. His expression remained composed, though something in his eyes, a contained pain, a resolute dignity, spoke volumes about the cost of this controlled revelation. "I believe," he said softly, "that's what they call the whole truth." That's not," Jake stammered, looking around wildly at the circle of shocked faces. "That's taken completely out of context." "What possible context," Michelle asked from the edge of the gathering, "could make that okay?" Dan set down his spatula, the forgotten burgers now smoking on the grill. "Jake, I think you should leave." "This is insane," Jake protested, turning to Sarah. Tell them this isn't what it sounds like." Sarah's gaze remained fixed on the ground, her silence a confirmation more damning than any words. "You recorded us?" Jake pivoted, anger replacing his initial shock as he advanced toward Nolan. "You spied on private conversations? That's probably illegal." "Baby monitor," Nolan replied simply. "In our nursery. Your Bluetooth connected to it automatically when you were in our driveway." His voice remained steady, matter-of-fact. "The nursery we prepared together, Sarah." A choked sob escaped Sarah as she finally looked up. "Nolan, Not here," he said, not unkindly. "Not now." "This is ridiculous," Jake tried again, looking desperately around the gathering for support. "Everyone has private conversations that sound bad when you hear just a snippet." "Jake," Elaine's voice cut through the chaos. She had returned from the house, standing at the edge of the gathering with arms crossed. "Stop talking." "Elaine," Jake began, but she raised a hand, silencing him. "Everyone heard you," she said, her quiet dignity a mirror to Nolan's. "Everyone knows." The social order of the gathering had completely inverted. Jake, who had commanded attention minutes before, now stood isolated as neighbors drew back from him, some moving instinctively closer to Nolan in silent support. "I think we should go," one neighbor murmured to his wife, and others began to nod in agreement. "No, please," Michelle said quickly. "Don't leave on their account." Her meaningful glance toward Jake and Sarah made it clear who would be expected to depart. Through it all, Nolan remained still, a fixed point of composure in the swirling social chaos he had unleashed. "I apologize for disrupting the gathering," Nolan said to Dan and Michelle, his voice low enough that only those nearest could hear. "That wasn't my intention." Michelle squeezed his arm. "You have nothing to apologize for." Across the yard, Sarah had moved away from Jake, standing alone with her arms wrapped around herself. Several neighbors had begun gathering their belongings, the festive atmosphere irretrievably broken. Jake had retreated to the fence line, angrily texting on his phone, his public persona shattered. "I think I'll head home," Nolan said, straightening his shoulders slightly. "Please tell everyone to stay and enjoy the food." "You don't have to go," Dan protested. "Jake's the one who should leave." "I know," Nolan acknowledged with a small nod. "But I'd prefer some quiet now." He moved with deliberate steps toward the side gate, the path deliberately chosen to avoid both Sarah and Jake. As he walked, neighbors reached out with supportive touches to his shoulder or quiet murmurs of sympathy. Nolan accepted each with dignified nods, neither encouraging nor rejecting the sudden solidarity. "Nolan," Sarah called, her voice breaking as she took a step toward him. "Please, can we talk?" He paused, turning to face her across the yard. The entire gathering held its breath, waiting for his response. In that moment, the depth of his pain was visible for just an instant before his composure returned. "Not today," he said simply. "I'll be at the house until tomorrow evening. You can collect what you need then." With that, He continued through the gate, closing it quietly behind him. The soft click of the latch seemed to release the collective tension, and voices immediately erupted in his wake. Nolan walked the short distance home alone, each step measured and controlled despite the storm inside him. Only when he had closed his front door, sealing himself within the privacy of his empty house, did he allow his shoulders to slump slightly. He moved to the living room window, looking out at the cul-de-sac where neighbors were now departing the Gibson home in small animated clusters. The truth had been spoken, the boundaries had been drawn, and in this moment of deepest betrayal, Nolan had found something unexpected, a core of strength that had withstood the public humiliation with dignity intact. He turned away from the window and faced the silence of his home, ready to begin the process of rebuilding from truth rather than illusion. Night had fallen by the time Nolan finished his third cup of tea, the kitchen illuminated only by the dim light above the stove. He hadn't bothered turning on more lights, finding strange comfort in the shadows that matched his interior landscape. The house was unnaturally quiet. In 15 years of marriage, he'd rarely been alone here for long. Even in silence, Sarah's presence had filled the rooms, her books on the coffee table, her cardigan draped over a chair, her scent lingering in the air. Now those same items felt like artifacts from a lost civilization, evidence of a life that no longer existed. The wedding photo he'd turned face down earlier now lay in a drawer. He couldn't bring himself to destroy it, yet couldn't bear to see it. 15 years, nearly half his life given to a relationship built on shifting sand rather than solid rock. He moved through the darkened house to the nursery, standing in its doorway without entering. The pale yellow walls they'd painted together, the crib he'd assembled with such hope, the rocking chair where he'd imagined holding their child, all of it poisoned now by deception, a child that wasn't his. The pain that surged through him wasn't just the loss of his marriage or even the public humiliation. It was the death of a future he'd believed in completely. Family dinners, first steps, school plays, graduation, a lineage continued, all of it built on lies. He closed the nursery door firmly, an act both symbolic and necessary. That dream was over. Acknowledging the truth of this loss was the first step toward whatever came next. His mind kept returning to the moment at the barbecue when he'd pressed play on the recording, not for the satisfaction of exposing them, but for the strange clarity that had come with that action. For perhaps the first time in months, there had been no deception between them, only hard, clean truth. Dawn broke through the kitchen window, finding Nolan at the table with his laptop open. He hadn't slept. Instead, he'd spent the night methodically reorganizing digital accounts, changing passwords, researching legal steps for separation. The practical tasks had provided anchor points through the emotional storm. He looked up when the doorbell rang, surprised to find Michelle Gibson on his porch, holding a covered dish. "I thought you might not feel like cooking," she said simply. "It's just a casserole." "Thank you." He accepted it with genuine gratitude. "That's very kind." "Nolan," she hesitated, "I want you to know that what you did yesterday, it took remarkable courage and dignity." He nodded, uncertain how to respond to direct praise for behavior that had felt less like a choice and more like the only possible path. After Michelle left, Nolan placed the casserole in the refrigerator and stood staring at the kitchen calendar. Sarah had marked her doctor appointments with small stars, appointments he now understood had been about a pregnancy he'd had no part in creating. He removed the calendar from its hook, about to throw it away, when something stopped him. Not sentimentality, but a realization that formed slowly and then crystallized with sudden clarity. The betrayal wasn't about him. This thought struck with unexpected force. Sarah's choices and Jake's behavior revealed their character, not his worth. He had been faithful, supportive, honest, and none of that had changed because of their deception. He replaced the calendar on its hook, a small act of reclamation. This was still his home, his life. His integrity remained intact even as his marriage crumbled. In the quiet kitchen, sunlight streaming through windows he had installed himself, Nolan felt something shift inside him. The pain remained, but it no longer defined him. What defined him was how he responded to this crisis, with truth rather than deception, with dignity rather than vengeance, with strength rather than collapse. For the first time since hearing Jake's voice on the baby monitor, he felt a sense of solid ground beneath his feet. Not happiness, not yet, but purpose. The certainty that his worth existed independent of others' betrayal. The medical building's antiseptic lighting cast everyone in an unflattering pallor. Nolan sat in the waiting room, his posture straight but not rigid, hands resting calmly on his knees. The clinical environment seemed appropriate for what needed to be done, clean, precise, factual. "Mr. Parker?" the receptionist called. "Dr. Abernathy can see you now." The doctor's office was warmly decorated in contrast to the sterile waiting area, with diplomas and family photos lining the walls. Dr. Abernathy, a woman in her 50s, with practical glasses and a direct manner, gestured to the chair across from her desk. "How can I help you today, Mr. Parker?" "I need to arrange a paternity test," Nolan stated without preamble. "My wife is pregnant, and I have reason to believe I'm not the father." If Dr. Abernathy was surprised by his directness, she didn't show it. "I see. There are several options available depending on your situation and timeline." She explained the procedures, non-invasive prenatal paternity testing that could be done as early as 8 weeks, or postnatal testing after birth. She outlined accuracy rates, costs, legal considerations. "And the results would be definitive?" Nolan asked. "The NIPT test is 99.9% accurate," she confirmed. "It requires a blood sample from the mother and a cheek swab from the potential father or fathers if multiple men are being tested." Nolan nodded, absorbing the information. "And this can be arranged without my wife's cooperation, if necessary?" Dr. Abernathy's expression softened slightly. "Legally, your wife would need to consent to her blood draw. However," she added, seeing his expression, "in my experience, when presented with a formal request, most people choose to cooperate rather than escalate to legal proceedings." "I understand." Nolan reached for the form she'd placed on the desk. "I'd like to proceed with the paperwork today." As he filled out the forms, methodically entering dates and information, Nolan felt a curious sense of peace. This wasn't about punishment or even vindication anymore. It was about establishing truth as the foundation for whatever came next. Divorce proceedings, property division, his own healing process. "What happens after the results?" he asked, signing the final page. "That depends on what you decide to do with the information," Dr. Abernathy replied. "The results themselves are just data. What matters is how you use them to move forward." Nolan handed her the completed forms. "Truth first," he said quietly. "Then decisions based on reality, not illusion." She nodded, respect evident in her expression. "We'll contact you when everything is arranged." As Nolan left the medical building, stepping into the afternoon sunlight, he felt the weight of uncertainty lifting, not because the situation had improved, but because he had chosen a path founded on truth, however painful, rather than comfortable deception. The test would simply confirm what he already knew. But that confirmation would become the cornerstone for rebuilding his life with integrity intact. Dr. Abernathy's office looked exactly as it had 2 weeks prior. Same diplomas on the wall, same family photos, same practical glasses perched on her nose. Only the envelope on her desk was new, containing the results Nolan had been waiting for. "Mr. Parker," she said, gesturing to the chair opposite her desk. "Thank you for coming in." Nolan sat with the same calm demeanor he'd maintained throughout the process, though his heart rate had quickened slightly. "Thank you for arranging everything so efficiently. As we discussed, we've completed the non-invasive prenatal paternity test." Dr. Abernathy opened the envelope, removing a single sheet of paper. "Your wife consented to the blood draw, and Mr. Wilson provided his sample as requested." She placed the document on the desk, turned so Nolan could read it. The clinical language was straightforward. The alleged father, Jake Wilson, is not excluded as the biological father of the unborn child. Probability of paternity, 99.9998%. Nolan studied the numbers, the scientific validation of what he'd already known. The confirmation brought neither shock nor fresh pain, only a quiet solidification of certainty. "These results are conclusive," Dr. Abernathy explained, though it wasn't necessary. "In layman's terms, Mr. Wilson is unquestionably the biological father." Nolan nodded, his finger lightly tracing the percentage figure. "I appreciate your thoroughness. May I ask what you plan to do with this information?" Her voice held professional neutrality tinged with genuine concern. "Establish clear boundaries," Nolan replied, folding the paper and placing it in his jacket pocket. "Nothing vindictive, just truth and the consequences that naturally follow." As he stood to leave, Dr. Abernathy rose as well. "Mr. Parker, I've been practicing for over 20 years, and I've seen many patients in similar situations." She paused. "Few handle it with your dignity." "Thank you," he said simply, "though I'm not sure dignity is a choice so much as a necessity. The alternative is—" He didn't finish the thought. Walking to his car, Nolan felt the weight of the document in his pocket. Physical proof of betrayal, yes, but also the foundation stone for rebuilding his life with integrity. The scientific confirmation had transformed suspicion into incontrovertible fact, creating solid ground for the difficult conversations ahead. Sarah was arranging flowers in the living room when Nolan arrived home, an obvious attempt at normalcy that felt jarringly out of place. She'd been staying with her sister since the barbecue, coming to the house only when Nolan was at work. "You're home early," she said, fingers nervously adjusting a lily. "I was just—" "Sit down, please," Nolan said quietly, placing his keys on the entry table. "We need to talk." She sank onto the couch, hands folded protectively over her still flat stomach. Her eyes followed him as he took the chair opposite, rather than joining her on the sofa, a physical boundary mirroring the emotional one. "I received the paternity test results today," he began, voice steady. "Nolan, I know what it says, but—" "Then we can skip that part," he interrupted gently but firmly. "Jake is the father. That's established fact now." Her shoulders slumped. "I never meant for any of this to happen." "I believe you," Nolan said, surprising them both with his sincerity. "But intention doesn't change reality. The reality is that our marriage is over." "It doesn't have to be," Sarah pleaded, leaning forward. "People make mistakes, terrible ones. But marriages survive affairs all the time. We could try counseling." "This isn't just an affair," Nolan replied. "You're carrying his child." I know it seems impossible right now, but you could learn to love this baby too, eventually. Sarah. Her name was both interruption and boundary. I need you to move out permanently. I've already spoken with a lawyer about divorce proceedings. Tears spilled down her cheeks. 15 years, Nolan? 15 years just thrown away? I'm not the one who threw them away. The words held no anger, only truth. I'm simply acknowledging what's already happened. What about forgiveness? She asked, wiping her eyes. Doesn't that matter to you anymore? Forgiveness doesn't require reconciliation, Nolan said, the distinction clear in his mind. I hope to forgive you someday, for my sake, not yours. But forgiveness doesn't mean pretending this didn't happen or that we can go back. He stood, signaling the conversation's end. You have until the end of the week to collect your things. I'll make sure I'm not here when you do. And after that? She asked, her voice small. After that, we communicate through our lawyers. He moved toward the door, then paused. I wish you well, Sarah. I truly do, but not here, not with me. The door closed behind him with a soft click that sounded like finality. The Wilson house sat directly across the cul-de-sac, its facade nearly identical to Nolan's own home. He rang the doorbell at precisely 7:30 p.m., knowing Jake would be home from work, but Elaine would be at her Thursday book club. Jake opened the door, surprise quickly masked by defensive hostility. What do you want? 5 minutes of your time, Nolan replied evenly. Jake glanced behind him, then stepped onto the porch, pulling the door nearly closed. Look, I don't want any trouble. That's exactly why I'm here. Nolan handed him the folded paternity test results, to make sure there won't be any. Jake scanned the document, his expression darkening. You had no right to— I had every right, Nolan interrupted, his voice calm but firm. As did Sarah. You both consented to the test, and now we all have scientific confirmation of what we already knew. Jake thrust the paper back at him. So what now? You came to gloat, threaten me? Neither, Nolan said, not taking the document. I came to tell you that you're going to move. Like hell I am, Jake scoffed. This is my house. You can't make me— Within 60 days, Nolan continued, as if there had been no interruption, you'll put this house on the market and move out of this neighborhood, preferably out of this town. Or what? Jake demanded, color rising in his face. Or I'll file a civil suit naming you as a co-respondent in my divorce. I'll seek damages for alienation of affection, which, given the paternity test and the recording, I'll win easily. Nolan's gaze never wavered. The proceedings would be public record. Every potential client, every business associate, everyone you know would have access to the details. You're bluffing, Jake said, but uncertainty had crept into his voice. I'm offering you a choice, Nolan corrected. Consequences can come with public humiliation or with quiet dignity. That's entirely up to you. Jake's bravado crumbled further. And if I move? Then we never speak of this again. You live your life. I live mine. In different places. The porch light cast harsh shadows across Jake's face as he processed the ultimatum. 60 days isn't enough time. It's more than generous, Nolan replied. I've already instructed my lawyer to prepare the paperwork. He'll hold it until the deadline. He turned to leave, then paused. One more thing. Sarah made her choice. Now you have one too. Whatever you decide to do about her and the baby, that's between you two. But you'll do it somewhere else. Nolan walked back across the cul-de-sac, leaving Jake holding the paternity results, the porch light illuminating the scientific evidence of actions that could no longer be denied or escaped. Behind him, the door closed with a decisive click. The coffee shop downtown offered neutral territory, public enough to maintain boundaries, private enough for honest conversation. Nolan had agreed to Sarah's request to meet, arriving early to select a corner table that afforded some privacy. She entered 10 minutes later, her pregnancy just beginning to show beneath her loose blouse. Her eyes found his immediately, relief crossing her face when he acknowledged her with a small nod. "Thank you for meeting me," she said, sliding into the chair opposite him. "I wasn't sure you would." "You said it was important." His tone was neither cold nor warm, simply attentive. Sarah's hands fidgeted with her napkin. "The divorce papers came yesterday." "Yes," Nolan confirmed. "My lawyer said they'd be delivered this week." "I'm not going to contest anything," she said quietly. "You're being more than fair with the settlement." Nolan nodded, waiting for her to reach the actual purpose of this meeting. "The thing is," Sarah continued, her voice catching slightly, "I need to say something to you. Not to change anything. I know that's not possible. But because it's true, and you deserve to hear it." She looked directly into his eyes for the first time. "I am deeply, genuinely sorry, Nolan. Not just for the affair or the pregnancy, but for betraying who we were together. For 15 years, you were nothing but honest and respectful, and I repaid that with deception." Nolan's expression remained neutral, though something shifted almost imperceptibly in his eyes. "What happened with Jake?" She shook her head. "There's no excuse. I could talk about feeling invisible or unappreciated, but those would just be justifications. The truth is, I made selfish choices that hurt the person who least deserved it." "Thank you for saying that," Nolan said simply. "I don't expect forgiveness," Sarah continued. "I just wanted you to know that I recognize what I destroyed. The life we had, it was good, and I'm only now understanding how good it was." A silence stretched between them, filled with the coffee shop's ambient noise. "I hope you find happiness, Sarah," Nolan finally said, his voice sincere despite its measured tone. "I mean that." She blinked rapidly against tears. "Jake and I aren't together, you know. After everything, it wasn't real." "That doesn't surprise me," Nolan replied, "but it's not my concern anymore." Sarah nodded, accepting the boundary. "You deserve someone who recognizes your worth, who chooses you every day." As they parted outside the coffee shop, Sarah hesitated, then spoke one last time. "I've learned something from all this. Truth matters, even when it's painful, especially then. That's something you always understood." Nolan watched her walk away, feeling not the reopening of wounds, but something unexpected, the first genuine closure. The moving truck appeared in front of the Wilson house, precisely 59 days after Nolan's ultimatum. Professional movers efficiently loaded furniture and boxes, while Jake supervised from the driveway, his phone pressed to his ear in continuous conversation. Nolan observed from his front porch, not hiding his presence, but not drawing attention to it either. Several neighbors found reasons to be outside, checking mail, watering plants, walking dogs, their curiosity barely disguised. Michelle Gibson crossed the street, carrying a plate of cookies that served as pretext for joining Nolan on his porch. "So he's actually going," she said, setting the plate on the railing. "He is?" Nolan confirmed. "Phoenix, I heard," Michelle offered. "Some job opportunity too good to pass up, according to what he told Dan." "That sounds like a reasonable explanation," Nolan replied, the ghost of a smile crossing his face. They watched in companionable silence as movers wrapped a mirror in blankets. The for sale sign goes up tomorrow, Michelle continued. Dan and I were thinking of recommending it to his brother's family. They've been wanting to move to this neighborhood. They'd be good neighbors, Nolan agreed. Across the street, Elaine emerged from the house, her expression unreadable as she handed a box to one of the movers. Unlike Jake, she'd maintained her dignity throughout the ordeal, quietly filing for divorce the same week Nolan had. She's staying with her sister until she finds a place, Michelle explained, following Nolan's gaze. The book club took her out last night. First time I've seen her smile in months. The last of the furniture disappeared into the truck. Jake made a final circuit of the empty house, then climbed into his SUV without a backward glance at the neighborhood or at Nolan. As the vehicles pulled away, several neighbors exchanged glances with Nolan, small nods communicating unspoken support. No one had directly mentioned the scandal since the barbecue, but the community's realignment was clear in 100 subtle ways. Invitations extended, supportive gestures offered, respect demonstrated. "Well," Michelle said, straightening up from the railing, "I suppose that's that." "Yes," Nolan agreed, turning away from the now empty house across the street. "I suppose it is." Nolan stood in the center of his transformed living room, surveying the changes. He'd spent the weekend rearranging furniture, donating items that carried too many memories, adding new pieces that were entirely his choice. The space felt different now, cleaner, simpler, authentically his own. The divorce had been finalized 3 days earlier with minimal drama, the documents signed and filed with the same efficiency that had characterized the entire process. Sarah had kept her word about not contesting anything, accepting the fair but firm terms Nolan had offered. He moved to the kitchen, where new cookware gleamed on the stove, part of his commitment to learning skills he'd previously left to Sarah. Last night's attempt at risotto had been surprisingly successful. Small victories, but meaningful ones. The phone rang, and he answered to hear Dan Gibson's voice inviting him to a neighborhood poker night. "Nothing fancy," Dan assured him. "Just a few guys, cards, and bad jokes." "I'd like that," Nolan replied, realizing he meant it. After hanging up, he carried his coffee to the back porch, settling into a chair to watch the sunset. The evening air carried the scent of freshly cut grass and distant charcoal grills, ordinary moments of life continuing despite everything that had changed. His thoughts turned to the future stretching before him, undefined but full of possibility in a way he hadn't anticipated when this ordeal began. The pain hadn't disappeared entirely. He suspected some echo of it would always remain, but it no longer dominated his consciousness or dictated his choices. What surprised him most was the absence of bitterness. He had expected to fight against resentment for years, but instead found himself experiencing something else entirely, the quiet satisfaction of having faced betrayal with dignity, of having chosen truth over comfort, of having established boundaries without cruelty. There was peace in that choice, not the shallow peace of denial or the forced peace of premature forgiveness, but the authentic peace that comes from living in alignment with one's deepest values, even when doing so is painful. Nolan watched as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new choices, new opportunities. But tonight, in this moment of hard-won tranquility, he allowed himself to simply be present with the knowledge that he had emerged from the crucible not just intact, but somehow more whole than before. He had reclaimed not just his home, but himself. 1 year later, Nolan sat on his back porch, watching the first light of dawn illuminate his garden. The raised beds he'd built last autumn were now flourishing with summer vegetables, a tangible symbol of growth emerging from what had once been empty space. The morning air carried a particular stillness, as if the world were pausing to acknowledge how far he had come. In quiet moments like this, Nolan often reflected on the journey that had transformed him from betrayed husband to the man he had become. A man who had discovered his own worth not through others' validation, but through living with integrity even when doing so was painful. The hardest truth he had learned was perhaps the most valuable: that dignity isn't the absence of pain, but the choice we make in its presence. When the ground had fallen away beneath him, he had discovered something unexpected: not just the capacity to endure, but the strength to rebuild on a foundation of truth rather than comforting illusion. He thought of others facing their own moments of betrayal or loss, carrying the weight of decisions that would shape their futures. If he could share one insight, it would be this: the path of truth, however difficult, leads to an authentic peace that pretense can never provide. Boundaries, when set with compassion rather than vengeance, become not walls, but foundations for genuine healing. The relationships in his life now, newer, fewer, but deeper, were built on mutual respect and honesty. He had learned to value not just the presence of others, but the quality of those connections. As the sun climbed higher, Nolan stood, ready to begin another day. The pain had not disappeared entirely. Such wounds never vanish without trace, but it had been transformed into something else: wisdom, resilience, a deeper appreciation for both truth and mercy. In the end, what had saved him wasn't forgetting the betrayal, but refusing to be defined by it. By choosing dignity over bitterness, truth over comfort, he had discovered that our greatest strength often emerges from our moments of greatest vulnerability, not despite our wounds, but because of how we choose to heal them.